I'm recording this on my phone. Before we get into the video, I want to say that everything is real and ain't fake, ain't AI, because there have been a few comments, people have been saying that, you know, because everything's AI now, the people have been saying the stories are fake, but different books I read, everything like that, so do not worry, okay? It's very much real, okay?
This is the haunting testimony of Erik Wallin, a Swedish volunteer who joined the Waffen-SS, drawn by the storm of ideology, the pull of brotherhood, or perhaps simply the irresistible tides of his time. In this story, he recounts the horrific last battles on European soil, where the continent's destiny was wrenched by fire and blood. What follows is not a cold account of generals or sweeping strategy, but the raw human truth from the mud and rubble, the eyes of a frontline soldier who watched Europe's old order crumble. Wallin's stories take us from the icy foxholes of Courland to the burning streets of Altdam, across desperate counterattacks and brutal house-to-house fights, to the final panicked crossings over shattered bridges. They are moments of terror, fury, and strange dark humour, memories soaked in sweat, dirt, and the cries of the wounded. Through Wallin's eyes, we witness the last convulsions of a war that scarred a generation and buried thousands of dreams with it. This is Erik Wallin's Europe, collapsing all around him, clutched in his dirt-caked hands, until the very end. We sat clustered around our roughly built bunker table, cards in hand, while the harsh voice of the front's New Year radio appeals droned through the crackling speaker, the highest commanders of all the services addressing us in solemn tones. Between these heavy pronouncements, we found lighter moments, tuning the dial to catch warm strains of Christmas music that reminded us of better places and times. It was still the festive season after all, and in our dim little underground shelter, we had done what we could to keep the spirit alive. By New Year's Eve, the bunker still managed to look almost homely. Despite the damp earth walls and the cold that gnawed at every joint, there stood our small Christmas tree, draped in fresh-cut spruce twigs, bits of tinsel, and the humble treasures we'd received from recent field post parcels. Those rough hands of ours, cracked, swollen, frostbitten, had nevertheless tended each decoration with surprising care. Even here, between Christmas and New Year's, we still clung to such comforts, stubbornly proving that we hadn't yet lost the need to mark these days as special. On the iron stove, a handful of battered canteens warmed with steaming glögg, our Nordic twist on mulled wine, spiced and strong. Now and then, each man would lift one of these carefully scrubbed tins to his lips, savouring a hot mouthful that stung the throat but spread welcome heat through the chest. Cigarette smoke curled thick and fragrant around the bunker ceiling. We had plenty to go around, courtesy of the generous Christmas parcels that also brought us sweets and biscuits. Cards smacked down on the rough tabletop in lively rhythms, punctuated by bursts of quiet humming that rose and fell with the melodies trickling from the radio. Occasionally someone cracked a sly joke that set the others chuckling, or the heavy silence was shattered by a thunderous snore from a comrade of the relief guard, dead asleep on the cold floor after his grueling watch. Then a harsh buzzing from the field telephone jarred us back to the war. I picked up the receiver to hear the company commander's clipped voice on the line, calling from his post deeper in the village. He needed me to prepare fresh fire corrections for the next morning. Our mortars were to target a new position within the enemy lines, and he ordered me to push forward to our closest outpost outside the village limits, to get a clear view of the ground we'd be striking come dawn. One of my comrades casually scooped up my cards, taking my place at the game as I stood. I pulled on my snow camouflage smock, slung the ammunition pouch for my submachine gun over my shoulder, and settled the white-painted steel helmet firmly on my head. Before leaving, I paused by the stove and took a long swig of steaming glögg from my canteen, then glanced around our bunker one last time. Strange how warm and inviting it seemed in that moment. Despite the damp earth floor pounded flat by countless boots, despite the crude planks nailed up along the dark, wet walls, Shadows of my comrades danced in the flickering candlelight, the shapes of men hunched by the radio or lost in quiet conversation. With my MP40 nestled under my arm, I gave the men a silent nod, pushed the frost-crusted door open with my foot, and stepped out into the biting night. Outside, a pale moon broke free from a drifting silver-edged cloud, washing the snowbound landscape in dazzling brilliance. The whiteness all around seemed to glow with a cold fire of its own, every contour razor-sharp under that ghostly light. I passed a small copse of trees, their trunks splintered by countless shells, bare branches twisted into grotesque shapes like something from a sinister fairy tale. They might have been wooden goblins standing guard in the snow. Ahead lay what was left of the village, or small town, or whatever poor ruin it now qualified as. The place looked even more spectral than usual under the moon's harsh scrutiny. Snow lay heavy over piles of shattered stone and broken timber where houses had once stood. Here and there solitary chimneys still jutted up like blackened fingers, somehow spared by Russian artillery. Across the white drifts, dark craters pocked the ground, raw scars left by that day's shelling. Where 12-centimetre mortar rounds had struck, they'd torn broad circular wounds, fringed by ugly black splashes across the frozen crust. No sign of life showed itself in those haunted ruins. Yet we all knew that if the alarm sounded, warning of an enemy push, men would burst forth like startled rats from countless cellars and dugouts. Hidden under the rubble, soldiers waited everywhere, ready to spill out and meet any Soviet assault with gunfire and grenades. This was our New Year's Eve in bunkers, that battered little nest in Courland, which had become, by cruel necessity, a vital knot in our defensive line. The HKL, the Hauptkampflinie, our so-called main line of resistance. Cut off from any hope of reaching mainland Germany, we held here as best we could, prepared to stem whatever tide Asia might send crashing westward. More than 3 years we'd been fighting on this endless eastern front, and for nearly 2 we had been retreating step by bloody step. Yet our will had not broken. Each day men dropped under shellfire or disappeared under collapsing trenches, yet we carried on. Even as our bodies ran dry of strength, even as our nerves felt scraped raw, the old fighting spirit clung stubbornly to our hearts. We still believed in the edge of our own steel, in the proven skill of our hands, certain that these things would carry us through against the massed barbarism pushing in from the east. Yes, the radios brought grim news from the west too, of British and American advances grinding ever deeper into Germany, of vast bomber fleets unloading their terrible burdens over our cities day and night. Whole neighbourhoods vanished in fire and rubble. But we also knew that vital parts of our industry had already gone underground, safe from the rain of bombs. New weapons were rolling off hidden assembly lines. Just days before, our forces in the Ardennes had struck with unexpected fury, sending shock waves through Belgium and Luxembourg. Surely that meant the Allies would feel pressure ease soon. We told ourselves we only needed a few more precious months to gather strength. Then we would strike back. And here in Courland, divisions like our 11th SS Panzergrenadier Nordland stood ready, stubbornly buying time for Germany to draw new breath. I ground out the tip of my cigarette against the bunker doorway, its glow a dangerous beacon in the dark. Our mortar crew's shelter lay roughly 300 metres behind the foremost trench line, while the company commander's command post was dug into the old cellar of what used to be the village railway station. He had instructed me to report there first for more detailed orders. It was a fair distance over churned ground, but I could move safely enough, screened from enemy eyes by the tangle of ruins. I shifted the ammo pouch more comfortably on my hip, tightened my grip on the submachine gun, and started off. A dead rat lay stiff on the path, its frozen teeth bared in a hideous grin. I kicked it aside with a muttered curse. Rats thrived in this shattered village, big greasy brutes that feasted on scraps and bodies alike. I wasn't the first to spit harsh words over these ruins, and not just in Swedish or German. Curses had been flung here in Danish, Norwegian, Russian, Mongolian. Who knew how many tongues before the land was done bleeding? I stumbled over frozen bricks and thanked whatever fate ruled that I did not have to worry about snipers tonight. Ivan's marksmen were thick in this sector, but they seemed content to let the new year come in quietly. Only the distant rumble of artillery reminded me we were still deep inside the war. My knees ached with each cautious step. Finally, I reached a half-collapsed wall about 20 meters from the commander's bunker. Between it and the entrance yawned a stretch of open ground, risky, as we knew the Soviets had lately seized a low rise beyond the railway embankment from which they could rake this spot with machine gun fire. Crouching low, I sprinted for it. Behind me, a Soviet gun spat, sending rounds whining through the frigid air. They smashed into bricks and dirt around me, singing off in cruel ricochets. But I slammed up against the bunker door untouched, heart hammering. Inside, the cellar was blessedly warm. SS Obersturmführer Hans-Gösta Persson, we called him GP, sat bent over a chessboard, eyes bright with thought. He was my countryman, and under that hard discipline that welded our ranks together ran a current of real comradeship, the kind that turned the Waffen-SS into something more than just a machine. Here, these men had even managed to make their lair homier than ours. A small wall hanging read, "Egen herd er guld värd." A hearth of one's own is worth gold. How that scrap of comfort had found its way to this far-flung outpost on the edge of the world, I could only wonder. Without lifting his gaze from the game, GP issued my orders in a calm, level voice. The matter was urgent. We were to silence that troublesome Soviet machine gun nest. Our mortars would... The company commander's plan was blunt and simple. He wanted to turn that patch of churned-up no-man's land into a graveyard for any Red Army soldiers foolish enough to show themselves come morning. After sketching out the mission, he poured me a hearty glass of Steinheger schnapps, saying it would warm the blood for the icy night ahead. I downed it gratefully, feeling the sharp spirit burn down into my gut, then stepped back out into the cold to carry out my orders. A narrow, winding trench led me from the headquarters bunker to the outpost, where 2 of our men manned a machine gun nest. As I drew closer, I could hear the sharp bursts of gunfire cracking through the air and felt a sudden spike of alarm. I ducked in beside them and asked what the hell was going on. One of the gunners laughed and shrugged. "Oh, that lot over there are blasting away into the sky for New Year's Eve," he said. "Seems rude not to answer." By then the madness had spread all along the sector. On both sides of the lines, rifles and machine guns popped and rattled in what had become an insane fireworks display of tracer rounds. The machine gunner shook his head, smirking. "Listen to them carrying on. Must be drunk as lords over there." Barely 50 meters beyond us, just past the railway embankment, the Soviets held their forwardmost position, a slit trench they only occupied at night. Many times they had sent men crawling across to lob grenades at our guards, but by day it was deserted. Now, though, the night rang with odd, almost festive noises. Somewhere out in the darkness, someone had started up a mouth organ, piping out a meandering tune, while others talked loudly, voices carrying clear in the frosty air. Gradually, the mad celebratory gunfire tapered off, then ceased altogether. Even the drunken Russians across the line fell quiet. Taking advantage of the lull, I set about my task, measuring distances, noting landmarks, making rough calculations for the next day's mortar barrage. The weather played its part, as passing clouds sometimes veiled the moon and gave me shadowy cover to scan terrain that would otherwise have been lit up like day. The entire battered landscape lay hushed, broken only by the occasional clink of metal or a muffled word from the Soviet trenches. Not even the usual rumble of truck columns or the grinding approach of tanks disturbed the stillness. Here and there a flare would shoot into the sky, throwing harsh quicksilver light over the torn fields and shattered ruins before fading, leaving the night deeper than before. So passed our New Year's Eve at the front. Somewhere in that eerie calm, standing in the trench beside my 2 comrades, a strange mood settled over me. The silent devastation all around, The odd sanctity of the date seemed to pull my thoughts far from the war. I was drifting in memory when a sudden voice, coarse and guttural, jarred us back. "Comrade, why so gloomy? Did you get cabbage soup again for dinner?" The words came slowly, thick with a mangled accent, but unmistakably spoken in German, the rough German of some Soviet soldier across the lines. It was as if he stood right beside us, instead of 50 meters away. My comrade clutched my arm, eyes wide. Never before in all our 3.5 years of grinding combat on the Eastern Front had we heard a Russian shout over no man's land in friendly banter. The First World War might have known such moments, but this war had been far too bitter, too soaked in hatred for that sort of talk. When the surprise faded, we burst out laughing. The other listening posts down the line caught on and joined in. That slow, lumbering accent, the harmless joke about soldiers' endless cabbage stew, landed like a well-timed slapstick routine. The machine gunner beside me raised his weapon and fired a jubilant burst into the air, and all along the trenches, automatic weapons chattered a moment in gleeful answer. Then silence fell again, as we waited, breath held, to see what might come next. From across the dark embankment, the same voice called out, plaintive and almost puzzled, "Why you shoot, comrade?" "If you come over here and play that mouth organ for us, maybe we won't shoot any more," our machine gunner shouted back with a grin. We peered carefully over the parapet. Could it be a trap? We had learned well how cunning Ivan could be. The Soviets had a talent for baiting men into false security. But tonight the sky had cleared completely. The moon and the gleaming snow combined to make everything almost unnaturally bright, so any trick would be plainly exposed. All along our line, men leaned forward, straining to catch what might happen next. From the Soviet side came an eager jumble of voices, debating, weighing. Then silence. I stared across through the broken doors of a toppled freight car that lay half buried on the track between us. Suddenly a head popped up there, silhouetted stark against the snow. Then shoulders, then more figures struggled into view. 3 Russian soldiers clambered out into the open, stumbling their way toward the railway embankment. At the edge of the wreck, the first man raised his mouth organ and played a few piping notes, proof enough of their bizarre goodwill. He and his companions tried to climb up on the car, but plainly they were too drunk to manage the feat. They slipped and skidded off, then gave up, collapsing in a giggling heap at its base. Even on our side, spirits were running high. Between the schnapps, the glögg, and the wine from our Christmas parcels, we were in a generous mood. Laughter rang up and down the trench as we watched the drunken Soviets struggle. Finally they lined up beside the car and launched into a tune. Slow and mournful at first, with curling minor keys that seemed purely Russian. Their faces were lost in shadow, but I could see how their padded tunics strained over heavy bodies as they swayed. Then the melody changed abruptly into something bright and fierce, like a Cossack dance. One of our machine gunners tried to bounce along in time, both feet leaving the ground, but the quickening pace defeated him. The Russians built up to a wild crescendo, then stopped dead. The middle player attempted a grand bow, overbalanced, and pitched face first into the snow. A wave of hilarity broke over both lines. From our side and theirs, men howled with laughter. The poor fellow staggered upright again, clearly stung by our amusement. As the laughter faded, a voice from farther back in the Soviet trench lobbed over a bawdy joke, so filthy and universal it needed no translation. Roaring chuckles rose again, echoing off the burned-out shells of houses behind us. The 3 musicians, arms thrown around each other's shoulders, staggered back toward their lines under a chorus of jeers and cheers. Our company commander, having heard the ruckus from his doorway, came sloshing through the trench to investigate. We all started babbling at once, eager to explain what we had witnessed. He listened, then threw up his hands with a laugh. "I have heard tales of this sort of nonsense," he said, "but to think it would happen here, against such a fanatical foe, with us Waffen-SS of all people, sounds like a drunken sailor's yarn out of Oslo." His smile faded a notch. "Still, keep your eyes open. I would not put it past Ivan to use laughter for cover." He He borrowed our trench mirror, swept it slowly across the wasteland beyond, peering for any sign of treachery. Satisfied for the moment, he sighed. "Watch yourselves, men," he said, then tramped back to his bunker. But incredibly, the absurd conversation picked up again. Across the snow, we swapped idle talk with our enemies. They bragged about the fine gifts they'd received for New Year's, and we countered with exaggerated claims of our own Christmas parcels, chocolate and cigars and brandy that had arrived in far richer quantity than truth allowed. The effect was instant. The Russians quieted, clearly impressed, though not for long. They were tough old soldiers, these Bolsheviks. After some grumbled debate, they raised their voices again and came back at us with their own tall tales, describing lavish packages that outshone even our boasts. It was so transparent a contest of one-upmanship that we nearly howled. The night was turning into a bizarre draw. Then salvation came in the simplest form. One of our guards, positioned just left of us, had received a curious gift from Westphalia, a pair of soft house slippers, absurdly out of place on this frozen front. With a grin, he shouted across about his splendid present. Silence fell over the Soviet side. Finally, someone called out in puzzled German, "What are slippers?" A comrade beside me, who knew a smattering of Russian, hollered back in a grotesque mash of their language. "Tufli! Tufli!" he shouted, waving his arms, trying to explain. But even then the Russians sounded mystified. It dawned on us that they had never seen such a luxury. In the workers' paradise of the Soviet Union, men went to war and sometimes came home without ever knowing the comfort of a simple pair of slippers. That was our true victory. You could almost call it total moral annihilation. The Russians fell completely silent. Somewhere in Westphalia, an old woman would have warmed her heart to know that her humble gift had helped win such a strange contest here at the edge of the world. But it did not end entirely on friendly terms. Their silence gave way to sullen voices. Rough jokes turned coarse. They asked for addresses of girls in Berlin, promising they would pay them visits soon. They boasted we would live comfortably enough in Siberia. When one of them crowed, "Hitler soon kaput," our machine gunner slammed the bolt on his gun and shouted back, "Send a card to that bandit in the Kremlin and tell him we'll be rolling east with our King Tigers soon enough. Then we'll see who shuts up." That mention of the mighty 69-ton tanks, nearly invulnerable to any Allied shell, seemed to rattle them. Their tone softened again. They tried to change the topic, offering to swap tobacco and cigarettes. But we knew too well the foul stench of their mahorka, that bitter brown weed we'd suffered in Russia. None of us wanted it, not even for the novelty of barter. So ended our surreal New Year's Eve on the Eastern Front, a night of snow and schnapps, of gunfire and ghost stories, of laughter shared across the void, with men who by dawn would once more be trying to kill us. Even though we were battle-hardened men, whose whole way of living had shrunk down to the desperate present, every thought ruled by survival from hour to hour, we still felt a profound respect for these quiet Pomeranian peasants who hosted us. Their world seemed a universe apart, while we were ragged front-line soldiers, living with death perched on our shoulders. They moved through life with calm assurance, guided by ancient customs and traditions passed down through countless generations. Their homes were full of hand-woven cloth, carved wooden chests, and sturdy furniture, each piece carrying the stamp of a culture rooted deeper than memory. Their simple religious beliefs, woven into their embroidery and the very shapes of their household tools, felt like echoes from the earliest days of our people. But as we lay there amid these still fields and barns, catching our breath for a fleeting moment, the war outside was swelling into something monstrous. The German counter-offensive in the Ardennes that had sparked such hope only weeks earlier ground to a halt, crushed beneath the relentless pressure of Anglo-American armies. At the same time, the massive Soviet forces broke through the Vistula line, the very barrier in which so many German hearts had pinned their last hopes. In a heartbeat, we were thrown back into the maelstrom. By the second week of February, we found ourselves staring across the fields at the Red Army once more. Everything had changed. Since the Vistula's collapse, the front lines had become a desperate patchwork. We had lost countless heavy guns, tanks, and crucial supply convoys under endless Allied bombing raids that choked every rail and road. Meanwhile, the Soviets rolled forward, whole new corps of artillery, wave upon wave of tanks, fresh troops pulled from every corner of their vast empire. We watched, stunned, as their new Stalin tanks trundled into view, massive barrels yawning, guns 122 millimeters wide, dwarfing our own. I still recall one day in particular when we fired off a battery of 10.5 centimeter infantry guns, trying to shore up our sector. With the naked eye, I could count over 200 enemy gun barrels lined up opposite us. They hadn't even bothered with camouflage. Our Luftwaffe was too busy battling Allied bombers far to the west to threaten them here. Against this juggernaut, we met them with Panzerfauster, machine guns, mortars, a handful of assault guns, and maybe, if we were lucky, a King Tiger. It was like facing down a modern machine gun with a stone and sling, but somehow we still held. It happened just east of Masso. The main defensive line clung to the edge of a forest, and I was ordered forward with 7 men to set up a blocking position in a slight dip in the field. We had 2 MG-42s, and our job was brutally simple: stop the Russian infantry from punching through. We arrived in the dead of night, taking over from a worn-out Wehrmacht unit. Rain came down in sheets as we groped our way to 3 shallow pits. I took the centre with Gebauer, a broad-shouldered farmer's son from Romania, and we settled in, praying the pit would offer cover when daylight broke. The other MG was off to our left, manned by 3 boys, while to our right 3 more huddled with submachine guns. If it came to a real attack, we were doomed. There was no trench behind us to crawl back to, only open killing ground. By daybreak we could only hope Ivan stayed quiet, but hope was wasted. Just after first light the Russian artillery began. What started as scattered booms built into a grinding avalanche. For hours it pounded our sector, shrapnel shredding the field back and forth as far as we could hear. In the gathering darkness, the gun flashes lit up the shredded landscape like some grotesque city under air raid. We hunkered down, filthy and soaked, trying not to lose our minds. Rain turned to steady drizzle. The soil around us turned to porridge, rising over our boots, clogging weapons. Within hours our heavy coats were sodden, dragging on us like lead weights. Mud sucked at every step. Mercifully, the men before us had dug well. Most shells screamed overhead to savage the main line behind. Only occasionally did one crash close, spraying our pit with icy clods. For 3 endless days and nights we lay there, starved, sleepless, soaked to the bone, waiting. On the 4th morning, in the dim grey twilight, Gebauer shook me hard. "They're coming," he hissed. I stole a look through the edge of the camouflage. 30 meters away, a tide of Soviets advanced. They were aiming to sweep right past us into the rear, and they hadn't seen us yet. Behind them, more troops ghosted through the fog. I grabbed the MG and cut loose, tracers slicing into the brown ranks. Screams went up as men dropped. The gunfire woke the others, and soon both our pits were roaring with bullets. The stunned Russians dropped flat, realized they'd stumbled on a hidden hornet's nest, and began wriggling for cover. To my left, I spotted a Bolshevik creeping through a low fold to flank us. We locked eyes, and in a blink, he brought up his submachine gun. Rounds zipped past my head. I seized an assault rifle, ducked, waited. We rose and fired in staggered rhythms, up, down, the duel closing to 20 meters. Then he made a fatal error, leaving his weapon exposed as he ducked. I squeezed the trigger and held it down. When he rose again, my shot punched through his forehead. His head snapped back, then slumped out of sight, dropping the gun. Angered by our resistance, the Soviets charged. One of our boys on the right leaped up with his machine pistol and hosed down a cluster of them, dropping maybe 10 before a bullet took him through the belly. The ground around us was littered with bodies, but we were losing too. I fired a red flare. Enemy attack. Hoping the main line would respond. Nothing. Another flare. Still no help. I was near tears with rage. As I helped Gebauer feed fresh belts into the MG, I cursed our rear line savagely, praying they weren't all asleep. Gebauer, crazed with adrenaline, pushed up high to see better. "Down!" I screamed. Too late. A bullet caught him under the eye and ripped through his throat. Blood poured as he clutched me, gasping, "Right, my mother!" His arms sagged, and he was gone. I was alone. Panic clawed at my chest. I forced myself to breathe, telling myself steady, calm, though I was shaking all over. Martin, the rotten Führer with the other MG, didn't heed my call to stay low. A bullet smashed through his brow and dropped him like a puppet with its strings cut. Now just 2 of us clung on. Our MG-42s rattled like saws, scything down each fresh Russian wave. For some reason, enemy mortars never zeroed in. Maybe it was chaos, lines too tangled to risk friendly fire. Suddenly we heard the thunder of "Hurrah!" from behind. They'd broken through. "Grab the gun and run!" I yelled. I flung an ammo belt around my neck, clutched the MG and sprinted in a zigzag across the field. My comrade pounded behind. A glance over my shoulder showed him clutching his chest and falling. His hand lifted weakly, then the Soviets flooded over him. Nothing I could do. I tore on, plunging into trees. 4 Soviets burst through brush ahead, submachine guns blazing. I dropped everything, gun, ammo, and bolted, bullets slicing the air around my legs. Somehow I outpaced death, dove through more undergrowth, and tumbled straight into the remains of our company. There was our Swedish commander coolly smoking a cigarette. He eyed my filthy, trembling shape. Not so bad, could be worse. Later I learned it was all an act. He was terrified we'd break. His calm mask in that pit of death kept the last few men steady. For a leader like that, you'd follow through hell itself. He quickly sent scouts to reconnect with flanking units and dispatched an Oberscharführer with 3 men, including me, on a so-called counterattack. 4 half-dead soldiers against a whole company's worth of Russians. It was madness, but discipline and sheer stubborn pride drove us on. We tore forward with mad cries, crashing through brush, spraying bullets. Amazingly, the Soviets broke. A Russian leapt up in front of me, frozen by shock. I stitched him across the chest before he could raise his gun. We retook the woods by sheer nerve, seemed to live an entire lifetime in those minutes. At the old edge we flung ourselves down and kept firing, holding off yet another wave. The Red Infantry broke at last, scattering from the shattered woods across an open field toward a low ridge that promised safety. We watched them flee, brown uniforms flapping, rifles dropped in panic. 2 unlucky stragglers, blind with fear, vaulted right over our trench, only to crumple just a few paces beyond us, their backs ripped open by bullets. When the dust settled, the whole field lay carpeted with enemy dead. And somehow, impossibly, all 4 of us who had charged survived. We looked at each other, stunned and grinning like lunatics in that sea of blood and twisted bodies. In another world we might have cheered. What a counter-attack it had been, but my heart hammered so hard I thought it would burst. A wave of crushing fatigue washed through us, turning our limbs to lead. One by one, the remnants of our company drifted back, pale, hollow-eyed, to reclaim the line we had just won. My commander, face hard but eyes strangely gentle, sent me back to the very foxhole that had eaten up 7 of my comrades already. So back I went, alone now with my MG, ringed by the corpses of my own men and countless enemies. I had never felt so small, so hollow, so utterly forsaken. Part of me longed to throw down my weapon and just run until my lungs burst, as far from this cursed ground as my legs could carry me, but duty locked its cold hand around my spine and forced me to stay. A low, ragged groan broke my spiral of fear. I peered carefully over the lip of the trench and spotted one of our boys sprawled awkwardly nearby, blood pooling dark beneath him. He had taken a bullet clean through both hips and the soft belly. Cursing under my breath, I crawled out, rolled him carefully over my shoulders, and began inching us both back toward the main line. I tried not to dwell on how exposed we were, praying that Russian eyes weren't hunting through their scopes at that very instant. By some small mercy, we made it. The same Oberscharführer, who had led us on that mad counter-attack, saw me stagger up and crawled out to help. Together, we got our comrade to a stretcher and carried him to the rear. Inside a big barn pressed into service as a field hospital, the straw was thick with the dead and dying. Everywhere lay men with faces twisted in agony, hands clawing at wounds, whispering for mothers who could never come. Groans and wet bubbling breaths filled the air. We did not linger. We fled that place of anguish and horror, hurrying back to my miserable foxhole. Not long after I settled back into my pit, scanning the dusk through weary, burning eyes, I caught movement at my 2 o'clock. I lifted my binoculars. Russians, creeping in the brush. I snapped out a report. Even as I slid down behind my gun again, the first 10.5 centimeter shells shrieked overhead, gouging the earth and shredding the new Soviet assault before it could get rolling. Twilight deepened over the torn battlefield. Soon darkness swallowed everything. The cold returned, biting through my damp uniform, setting my teeth to chattering uncontrollably. I sat there in the oppressive blackness, my mind a feverish carousel of grotesque images. Gebauer's eyes glazing over, the bodies in the barn, the twisted limbs of friend and foe alike. Now and then a faint rustle or broken whisper crawled close, Soviet night patrols probing our lines, their hushed breaths carrying all too clearly, each sound stabbed through me like ice. Finally, near dawn, relief came. A company of Wehrmacht infantry slipped into our trenches to take over the defence. The handful of us who survived stumbled back to where our vehicles waited, beginning the journey to a brief, precious rest. We were all that remained of what, just days before, had been a full-strength company of SS Panzer Grenadiers. For a week after Masso, my hands trembled so badly I could barely light a cigarette. And the men who had taken our place? Within days, they were all dead. Then, almost cruel in its gentle beauty, came our respite. We rested, checked over our battered half-tracks and weapons, wrote letters home. Spring had come early to this rich part of Pomerania. The sun blazed out of a flawless blue sky day after day, and bright green shoots already speared up through the black soil. Wild anemones and other shy flowers painted patches of colour in the meadows, and swallows wheeled overhead with dizzy, playful chirps. It was a dream to stretch out in the new grass, close your eyes, and banish every thought of war. The ponds and little lakes had long since shrugged off their ice. By late February we were splashing naked into cool water each morning, scrubbing off grime and feeling our battered bodies grow strong again under the caress of sunlight. But even here, far from the front, the shadow stretched toward us. The great tide from the east rolled on, carried by tens of thousands of American trucks, fed by millions of tons of Allied supplies. It had already smashed the outer ramparts of our civilization, reduced countless towns and ancient churches to rubble. The proud fruits of centuries of Nordic Germanic settlement and labour were being trampled under the boots of men drawn from every corner of Asia. Yet still we believed. Could our entire world truly fall because a few powerful men, drunk on hate or fear, had chosen to break the last wall holding back this barbarian flood? We had seen too many bright young faces, too much cheerful courage and willing sacrifice among our lines, to give in fully to the doom-laden visions of Oswald Spengler, his cold prophecy of the West's twilight. Only the sudden roar of fighter bombers broke the spell of our rest. Russian and American planes swooped down without warning, their guns turning civilians and soldiers alike into torn meat. Fields ran with blood, not only ours but that of farmers' wives, girls in their Sunday dresses, even children skipping off to school. Each strafing made our jaws clench in helpless fury. Soon we heard the deeper rumble from the east, heavy and ominous. The front was no longer something we had to march toward. It was coming to us. We watched the local families pack up what they could, loading wagons and carts, weeping women wringing their hands while grizzled old farmers set their jaws hard, lips pale and eyes glittering. As dusk bled across the sky, convoys of ambulances began rolling by, full of the newly maimed. We had grown accustomed to walking down to the road after supper, cigarettes glowing as we talked with villagers or maybe stole a smile from a farm girl. But that night none of us could face it. None wanted to look into the wagons and see men torn open, eyes wide with shock or dark with morphine, uniforms crusted with black blood. Why stare so directly into a fate that, in a few hours or days, might be our own? The waiting was the worst. Once you were back on the line, nerves burned off quickly in the urgent business of killing or staying alive. But in the hours before, when the sky still held its bright hush and the guns were only distant rumblings, then every heartbeat seemed a countdown to judgment. All night the thunder rolled closer. I lay wide awake, like many of the others. We smoked endlessly, whispering about nothing at all, trying to trick our minds into calm. Some who managed to drift off woke thrashing from nightmares, gasping like drowning men in the straw. By morning, our platoons were lined up and reported ready to march. The company commander gave us a curt briefing on the situation ahead. With that, we set off. As we rolled out onto the main road in our half-tracks, the grim reality of the war's new phase struck us full in the face. Streams of refugees clogged the roads. Families trudged along with handcarts and horse-drawn wagons piled with all they could salvage of their lives. Their clothes and hair were streaked with a pale yellow dust that coated everything. Red-rimmed eyes looked up at us as we passed, some blinking away tears, but still they found the strength to wave. It was a sight that hollowed your gut. These ragged people who had clearly been on the road through the entire night, hoping somehow to stay ahead of the flames, licking eastward. The march slowed to a crawl as the refugee tide thickened. A few kilometres on, we overtook a Wehrmacht medical convoy, tending to the aftermath of yet another American fighter sweep. Around 100 old men, women, and small children sat or lay by the roadside, many bleeding, some beyond saving. In a ditch, beside an ambulance, a young woman cradled a limp bundle in her arms. Blood streamed down her face from a gruesome flap of torn forehead that drooped over her eyes. Rocking back and forth, she let out a low, broken chant, "My baby, my baby." We halted while men dragged 3 dead horses and an overturned wagon from the road. The moans and sobs of the wounded grated on our nerves. Fury bubbled up inside us at this senseless slaughter of the defenceless. When we finally moved on, no one spoke. Even our usual bleak jokes. The black humour that helped steel us before a fight died in our throats. The entire column, the full reconnaissance battalion, rolled slowly northeast, parallel to the front. Artillery boomed somewhere distant, but didn't come nearer. We drove on in long, widely spaced lines across the flat Pomeranian landscape. The evening crept in quietly. It looked like there would be no engagement that day. We trundled past neat farms and grand country houses that had stood for centuries. Rows of trees as straight as lances lined the roads, broken here and there by modest stone churches. I wondered bleakly if all this would be cinders and twisted iron in a week's time, drowned under the black clouds of battle smoke. Night finally closed over us, but we kept rolling. Off to the right the horizon glowed with an unsteady red, pierced by the flicker of burning houses. Sometimes the quiet was shattered by distant crashes or the rattle of machine guns. Then, for a breath, silence again, only to be ripped apart once more by sudden death. As we drew nearer, the heavier guns fell silent, replaced by the uneven stutter of automatic weapons. Toward dawn on March 3rd, we reached the village of Vossberg. Orders came down to halt while company commanders went off to confer with the battalion staff. It seemed calm enough. Rifle and machine gun fire crackled from time to time a few kilometres off, but nothing close. The locals had already fled, leaving the village ghostly and hollow. It felt almost luxurious to stretch out after hours jammed in the half-track. With Oberscharführer Kunze, I explored a large, elegant house. Behind its spacious kitchen, we found a bedroom stripped of blankets and sheets. Not that we needed white linens, it was enough to lie down. We decided to keep our boots on, just in case. I barely heard Kunze's first monstrous snore before I too dropped into a deep, grateful sleep. A colossal boom yanked us violently awake. I was out of bed and into the kitchen in a single bound, Kunze stumbling behind me. Another deafening crash. Bram! Shook the house. We risked a glance back into the room. The mattress Kunze had just vacated was shredded on the floor, splinters and shell fragments everywhere. Kunze threw back his head and let out a wild bark of laughter. Lucky again, eh? That was the only kind of luck a frontline soldier ever got. Blind, savage fortune that spared you by inches. Without it, no man survived long enough to be called seasoned. We crouched low and sprinted into the street. Chaos reigned. Men were running in every direction, diving for vehicles. Lindenau from my platoon came tearing toward me, eyes wide, rare for that unflappable veteran. "We're trapped! To 34s coming from the west!" Tank guns barked, muffled booms that set our guts quivering. We flattened ourselves, bracing for impact, but the shells howled overhead. Then Wehrmacht infantry came staggering in from the east, breathless, shouting that Russian troops were attacking from that side. The situation was a total mess. Tanks closing our rear, infantry blocking our front. The second platoon darted off between burning houses to stem the infantry push. And then, with a grinding roar, salvation appeared. A king tiger lumbered into the village square, filling the entire street, bricks raining down as it scraped against buildings. A young Unterscharführer ran ahead, waving hand signals to guide the behemoth. My heart surged at the sight. What passion for battle floods your veins when such a monster is on your side? Through a gap I glimpsed the Russian armour, 8 or 10 T-34s down a curved avenue, firing at will, but their shells skidded harmlessly off the tiger's thick skin. Our Colossus returned fire with clinical calm. Flames licked up the nearest T-34, then another. In 4 blistering minutes, 4 tanks were smoking wrecks. The rest wheeled frantically to escape, only to be smashed by shells that found their flanks. We cheered like madmen as the tiger's gunner popped up from the hatch, soot-faced and grinning. "Out of the village!" came the order. Just then, Russian artillery began pounding. We dove into half-tracks and roared away, weaving around blackened T-34s and the stiff bodies of their crews. The convoy charged down a dirt road, paralleling a new highway. Ahead, a viaduct spanned our path. I spotted the men of the second platoon sprinting across the fields to rejoin us beyond the overpass. But disaster struck. The lead armoured car skidded on loose gravel and stalled right under the viaduct. My driver braked hard to avoid ramming it. The whole column bunched up, packed tight. Then the real horror began. Barely 150 meters beyond the bridge, 3 Russian anti-tank guns opened up, shells shrieking through the tunnel toward us. We popped smoke grenades, hoping to mask our position, and I barked at my crew to bail out. The driver grabbed the half-track's MG and I rolled into a ditch, spraying suppressing fire. Shells burst sickeningly close, throwing dirt and hot shrapnel. Someone screamed, hit by splinters, and was hauled back to the vehicles. The men worked frantically to restart the stalled armoured car. Finally, it chugged to life. Everyone piled back aboard. I was the last, hurling myself onto the moving half-track, strong hands dragging me to safety. Under our fierce covering fire, the Russians faltered. We smashed through the tunnel and sped away. A few kilometers on, we reached a village. Just ahead, a knot of Russians were unhitching a small anti-tank gun from a cart. When they spotted our column, they froze, then bolted in all directions. The lead car swerved, but I drove my half-track straight through. The cart exploded into splinters. Something soft slammed against our armour, and we thundered on. Our machine guns stitched the fleeing Soviets, bodies tumbling in grotesque arcs. They seemed to be everywhere now, clearly a real breakthrough. Just beyond the village, we ran into Untersturmführer Schwarz of the 4th Company. How he'd gotten there was a mystery. He signalled us to halt and ordered me to deploy my half-track and crew 100 meters out in the fields. "Untersturmführer, my orders are to stay with the vehicle under all circumstances," I protested. "Even if your position is desperate." He bristled. "I'll report you for refusing orders." But before he could carry on, shells ripped into the road. A cluster of men from nearby half-tracks were shredded before our eyes. Schwarz went pale, then bolted into a crewless vehicle, shouting, "Drive like hell!" We tore away, wheels hammering over rough ground. A little further on, we passed a small cluster of SS men standing rigid by the roadside, staring at a bloody heap. As we slowed, I realized with a sick twist that a hand was waving weakly from the gore. My heart dropped. It was Untersturmführer Meyer, my fellow countryman, the favourite of our company. His chin was sliced open, a shard of metal lodged deep in his neck. Blood drenched his chest, his legs were punctured with countless shrapnel holes. Yet he was alive, even trying to joke with his mangled mouth. His voice was a slurred whisper. I promised we'd get him to a first aid post. Meyer had always been almost absurdly lucky. In Estonia he'd been so badly wounded that another unit laid him among the dead. His tunic, with his pay book, got switched with the corpses, and our commander had mourned him, even sending condolences to his professor father in Stockholm. Months later, Meyer reappeared, slightly scarred, snapping off a crisp salute to a stunned company. We had laughed then. even if someone probably still mourned the loss of his extra schnapps rations. Now, gentle hands lifted him into our half-track. We gathered up other wounded along the road and sped to quieter ground. In the next village, we ran into Sturmbannführer Saalbach, the Abteilung commander. As Meyer was laid out on the grass, he tried desperately to brace himself upright and managed a feeble salute, mumbling some mangled report through his torn jaw. Saalbach, a grizzled veteran, looked deeply moved. He laid a hand on Meyer's shoulder. "You look terrible," he said softly. We watched them carry Meyer away. Against all odds, he survived again. Doctors dug out every bit of iron except for one small sliver that would stay lodged in his neck forever. But he never came back to us. After Vossberg, with our ranks hollowed by relentless fighting, we finally received fresh reinforcements. Trucks arrived bringing new faces, mostly young boys pulled straight from the Hitler Youth. They burned with raw belief and a reckless eagerness that sometimes had to be physically restrained, lest they throw themselves into death for glory's sake and leave half our platoons in the mud on their first day. But these green lads proved themselves swiftly, the usual tough initiation that old hands gave newcomers, that rough testing of worth on the front, faded fast. In no time, these boys stood shoulder to shoulder with us, fully grown as soldiers in every sense. We passed through a bitter spell of scattered skirmishes and probing attacks. From time to time we launched small counter-assaults that gained a few precious fields or hedgerows, only to slip back again under mounting pressure. By then, the entire front was a living thing, crawling backward, inch by stubborn inch. The only reason the Soviets didn't drive us clean into the Baltic was their own need to pause, to haul up vast batteries of artillery for the next crushing advance. Our role felt heartbreakingly clear: delay them, slow them by whatever scraps of ground we could bleed them for, waiting, though none dared say it, for salvation that would never come. Again and again, the division entrenched, struck, pulled back, leaving behind shattered companies as thin walls of resistance against entire Soviet divisions. In that way we slogged on, clawing at the edge of oblivion. It was amidst this grinding retreat that we came to Gross Wakllin, east of Stettin. Some of our companies managed a spirited counter-attack there, clawing 2 vital hills from the enemy. Once the fight surged on, we were ordered forward to hold what they'd won, anchoring the division's breakaway from Soviet grip. My mortar platoon was sent around to the rear, on the right flank of those hills. Other platoons dug in on the nearer slope and fanned out before it. We drove our mortar half-tracks up the western side, hugging the hill's curve for what cover it offered, until we nestled close beside a massive farm complex built square atop the rise. We unloaded the mortars and set them up right in the courtyard, ammunition piled at the ready. Our company commanders rattled off target coordinates over the radio. It had to run like clockwork, as always. There was no shortage of shells. We only waited for the inevitable red assault, prepared to saturate every dip and stand of oaks where they might muster. For now, the Soviets sent probing mortar rounds. Black fountains of earth erupted around us, sending showers of grit rattling off helmets. Between blasts, we heard the dry rattle of rifle and machine gun fire skirmishing through nearby copses and farms. Then, at dawn, came a familiar rumble, heavy, rhythmic, unmistakable, Stalin tanks. Almost at once, their artillery opened up in earnest. Shells shrieked overhead and slammed down across a broad swath, then swept deeper. Shouts rose, and suddenly Red Army soldiers spilled from their holes, racing across torn fields toward our lines. At last our time came. The forward observer's voice snapped through the line. 20 plus on Erik. I barked it back. 20 plus on Erik, and the teams set to work. The men handled the mortars with smooth precision, almost mechanical in their calm. Orders came quick and sharp. 30 minus on Manfred, 5 rounds. Rottenführer Kraus, our rock-steady observer up front, directed us with a level, unhurried tone, even as the Soviets closed in. Rounds thumped away in crisp succession, barrels clanging and bouncing. Target, adjust, fire again. Between our bombardment and the company's small arms fire, the Russian charge buckled, retreating across the churned ground, leaving bodies strewn among smoking craters. But we knew what was coming. They could hardly miss the savage mauling our mortars were handing them. Soon enough, their artillery found us. The courtyard erupted in concussions. Shells ripped through roof beams, sending jagged timbers flying. Fires bloomed, climbing the barns and outbuildings, until we stood in a square of raging flame under a coal-black sky. In that hellish light, our sweat-streaked faces looked ghostly as we kept feeding red-hot barrels. Then silence on Krause's line. Dead? Line cut? We had no time to find out. Still linked by radio to the company commander, we were ordered to keep firing on shifting targets. Smoke from burning straw and hay settled over us like a choking lid, stinging eyes and lungs. Somewhere nearby, a building collapsed with a hollow roar. A man staggered by with half his calf gone. Another clutched a bloody arm. The gate that was our only way out threatened to crumble any moment. Hours dragged by. Then we heard tank engines growling close, barrels swinging toward the flaming yard. Small arms fire crackled just beyond the walls. Dawn brightened the sky. Soon we'd be fully visible. I dashed to the half-track to raise the company. Deadline. My hands fumbled over switches, wires, dials. Nothing. Exposed against the searing backdrop of flames, I ran to the north side, dove into a bush, and scanned the lightening horizon. There, the blocky shapes of tanks, barely 200 meters off, their silhouettes distinct in the growing dawn. From the saddle between the hills came the chilling chorus of Russian hurrahs. It felt like the end. I collided with a dispatch rider in the gate, blood oozing from a gash on his cheek. Gasping, he blurted, "Pull back! They've broken through!" We hauled our wounded into half-tracks, scrambled to sling mortars back aboard. The dispatch rider collapsed into my vehicle. Engines roared. As we rolled down the hill, red infantry poured around us on every side, dark shapes darting between hedges and across open ground. But none raised rifles. None of us fired either. Better to pray they took us for one of their own in the early gloom. To be captured, especially as SS, meant a bullet to the neck, or worse. The rider leaned close, voice tight. When the radios failed, he said, "The commander sent a first dispatch rider, wounded on the way. He managed to crawl back, reporting failure. As the remnants of the company mounted up, this second rider had made it through by sheer luck. Minutes before the Russians sealed the gap completely, those scant moments were our reprieve from total slaughter. At full throttle, we tore across fields, found the road to Stettin Altdam, and finally linked up with the battered remains of the company. The price was steep. Too many faces were missing, names we'd only recently grown accustomed to pairing with voices and laughs. Most painful for us Swedes was Arne Johansson. A true Swedish socialist, he had left behind a devoted wife and 3 small children, determined to stop the tide here in the east before it ever reached his home. Too often his fierce spirit needed reining in, his eagerness bubbling over when bullets began to fly. On March 1st it finally claimed him, gunned down in a desperate counterattack at Ravenstein. The Russian onslaught against us had swelled into something monstrous, a brutal hammering that hurled waves of artillery and endless legions of infantry at our crumbling lines. These were no longer just Russian or Ukrainian divisions. Those formations had bled white long ago. Now we faced masses of Kirghizians, Kalmucks, and Mongols, driven forward by commissars with pistols drawn, as though the steppes themselves had risen to engulf us. They pressed ruthlessly against our shrinking bridgehead at Stettin. By early March, that bridgehead had been squeezed down to Altdam on the Oder's eastern bank and its few battered surroundings. To the north and south, Soviet spearheads already touched the river. Stettin simply had to hold, for if it fell, the Russian tide would surge unchecked against our comrades struggling to hold Kustrin and Frankfurt an der Oder, smashing open the road to Berlin's very heart. Both the Soviets and our own high command knew how critical this ground was. That was why they stripped entire fronts, even drawing elite divisions and mighty batteries from Courland, to pile everything into this sector and shove us finally across the Oder. The Courland lines quieted noticeably. Their artillery, tanks, even their best infantry had all been thrown against us here. They meant to break us for good. Day and night we were buried under a hurricane of fire. The heaviest howitzers, screaming Stalin organ rockets, 120mm mortars, every caliber of gun down to sharp-nosed anti-tank shells. It all rained on us without pause. The ground never stopped quivering, as if the earth itself shivered in terror. We were crammed into that narrow pocket with our men, guns, stores, fuel, and ammunition, a single vast powder keg. Casualties mounted hideously. Our company commander Persson was hit and carried across the bridge into Stettin. One of our toughest platoon leaders, SS Oberscharführer Hopper, had been blinded by an exploding bullet. Carried down into a cellar, he lay on the cold cement floor, face a hideous ruin of blood and torn flesh. His breath came ragged, fists clenched so tightly the knuckles shone through the grime. When two men tried to leave to find a stretcher, Hopper lifted himself painfully on one elbow and rasped, "What's that damn talk? An SS man walks himself so long as he's got legs." With a long, raw groan, he rolled over, pushed himself upright by sheer force of will, and staggered to his feet. In that dim cellar light, his ruined face gleamed ghastly white through crusted blood. Arms outstretched, he lurched for the door. Two comrades caught him, supporting him gently. "Hold me steady. They haven't finished me yet," he growled. Then they led him stumbling out into the whistling shell fire, across shredded gardens and past smashed workers' cottages toward the nearest aid post. Watching him go, we felt the loss already. A lion among us brought low, still strong as an ox, now doomed to a life of darkness. The bridgehead shrank by the hour. Soon it looked just like one of those desperate hedgehog pockets we'd grown used to over 2 years of retreat from Russia. Only one path remained, the bridge back into Stettin. By then, the Russian lines lay scarcely 100 meters from Altdam's city limits. Their guns pounded us without rest, smothering the town in thick, reeking columns of black-brown smoke. Sleep was out of the question. The earth trembled constantly, the air itself throbbed and wailed with bursting shells. Everywhere you looked were haggard, grime-smeared faces. Supplies reached us irregularly. More than once food patrols were blown apart before they got through. We could endure hunger. It was the bone-deep exhaustion that hollowed us out. Our eyes burned, our faces stiff from soot and sleepless nights. No corner of that blasted ruin was free of the wounded's moans, squeezed into every breath between the shell bursts. Concrete cellars imploded like flimsy toys. Bunkers turned to tombs when delayed action mortar rounds punched through the roofs and shredded the men packed inside. I had my mortar platoon set up in the courtyard of a house already half demolished, just outside the town's main blocks. We crouched among heaps of broken brick, twisted beams, splintered radiators, and smashed furniture hurled out by earlier blasts. Yet the men worked with stoic calm, feeding round after round into the barrels even as the air filled with splinters. Our observer, a sturdy Unterscharführer, was holed up in a cellar ahead, guiding our fire by field phone. As long as that thin thread held, our shells soared without pause. No platoon could have stood up better under such torment. Many of these men had fought since Narva and Dorpat. Even the newcomers rose to it, drawing courage from the older veterans' unflinching steadiness. Weeks of this purgatory had left them either broken shells or forged steel, but that fragile phone line was everything. Over and over shells shredded it, and I had to send pairs of signallers out into the screaming shrapnel to find and mend the breaks. It tore me up every time. These men, the Strippenzieher, had one of the war's most lethal jobs. Already I'd lost 3 since we arrived. Magnificent comrades, all of them. Their fearless trudges through the iron rain were the only reason our mortars kept singing. That evening, the new company commander ordered me forward to relieve our observer, who had finally cracked. That told me enough about what awaited. I left our calm Kraus in charge at the command post and set off. The Russian guns had slackened somewhat. I barely noticed them. What rattled me far worse was the closer crack of small arms fire. Somewhere just ahead, men were clawing at each other at point blank. Bullets snapped and spat through the dark, some of them the cursed explosive kind. Those always terrified me more than any shell. They zipped past with an ugly snarl, hit a branch or beam, and burst. I crept forward like a frightened child skirting graves. It was only a few hundred meters, but it felt endless. The gloom occasionally lit with flares or the strobe of muzzle flashes. Finally, I reached the ruined stairwell and slid down into the observation cellar. As I shut the door behind me, a suffocating reek of old sweat, blood, and engine oil hit me like a wall. A burning rag in a tin of oily sludge was the only light, set on a delicate Chippendale table, absurdly out of place here. Nearby, an Untersturmführer manned the radio, his muddy boots scratching the fragile legs of an ornate chair. A submachine gun hung off its elegant backrest. 2 mangled bodies lay on the floor, wrapped in bloody coats that did nothing against the cold cement. They wheezed horribly. One had no face, just a hollow mass that rasped wetly with every laboured breath. Blood streamed from the other's mouth. A medic fluttered helplessly between them. Neither would live long. The man I came to relieve sat hunched on a camp bed, head buried in trembling hands, fingers raking through his hair. Each nearby explosion made him flinch, eyes wide with terror. Across from this horror sat Untersturmführer Schwarz, utterly unruffled. Perched on a sugar crate, he calmly hunted lice. His shirt lay discarded, and he peered with mild satisfaction through the hair on his chest and armpits, methodically pinching out tiny parasites. When he found one, he squinted at it in the smoky light, cracked it between his nails with a quiet pop, and flicked it into the burning oil. Now and then he glanced at the dying men, and shook his head with gentle pity. Without breaking stride, he murmured to the officer by the radio, "You see what's coming? It'll be hell for us." Then he went right back to his slow search. At that moment our new company commander ducked inside. Schwarz rose, trousers around his thighs, snapping to attention. The officer, fresh from Berlin, clearly struggled not to gape. But he managed to accept Schwarz's report with a straight face. Then he noticed the 2 ruined soldiers. He knelt beside them, speaking low, but received only breathy, bubbling groans. He whispered something almost tender, then turned away, his expression hard to read. The new company commander knelt down by the 2 men sprawled on the cold cement. He spoke to them in a low, almost fatherly voice, hoping for some reply, but received only strained, rattling moans. Rising stiffly, he gave them both a short, solemn salute, a final gesture of soldierly respect to comrades already half lost to the world. Beside him, Schwarz, still clutching his half-buttoned trousers, continued his businesslike report as if nothing were amiss. The Unterscharführer I had relieved, nerves frayed to breaking, wandered outside to relieve himself. A second later, a deafening roar slammed the cellar. The door burst open, and he staggered back down the steps, coated in chalk dust, tunic in tatters, fresh scratches seeping along his face and hands. His eyes were wild, his entire frame shaking as though palsied. He stammered, words breaking over each other, trying to explain that a shell had struck just where he'd been standing, shredding the wall above him. He was utterly done. His spirit simply snapped. The company commander took him gently by the shoulder, led him out, and sent him rearward before he and his orderly themselves departed the cellar. Outside, the Russian artillery rampaged through the night, hurling thousands upon thousands of shells into our lines. My corner of the company took its share. It seemed nothing short of miraculous that our shelter hadn't yet been flattened, burying us all in that stinking crypt. As dawn crawled closer, the bombardment surged into an unbroken drum roll, each individual blast blending into one vast roar. Trenches and bunkers were smashed flat, men torn apart in grisly sprays. Then the barrage crept forward, and behind it rolled the Soviet infantry. They struck like a hammer. We met them hand to hand amid shattered buildings and smoking rubble. But at several points they clawed through. We simply lacked the reserves to seal those breaches, so orders came to disengage, to fall back yet again to makeshift lines at Altdamm's edge. But any hope for a pause vanished immediately. The Russian guns never slackened. Explosive bullets zipped and cracked with merciless regularity, bursting bodies and smashing walls. The fight transformed into a different, uglier beast. No longer fields and copses, but house by house, street by street. Everywhere you turned, red infantrymen boiled forward, only to be cut down, their bodies piling up like grotesque barricades. Yet still they came, a relentless yellow-brown tide. They waited around corners as tanks and artillery blasted our positions to dust, then stormed forward in fresh swarms, pouring into basements, clawing up staircases, room by room, house by house. It was as if they had no end. Against this human flood stood a threadbare wall. Us. SS men so reduced in number you could practically count them. Each hour thinned our ranks further, but every man fought with a savage desperation I had never before witnessed. Lightly wounded men snatched quick bandages at the nearest aid station, then dragged themselves straight back into the melee. Any soldier still able to stand and shoulder a weapon hurled himself into the fight, faces dark with grime and fury, bandages poking from under helmets, eyes red from smoke and sleeplessness. Our strength ebbed by the minute. More and more comrades were carried away, or simply left where they fell. No fresh troops came to replace them. What remained was a ragged line of gaunt veterans, uniforms ripped and blackened, faces masked with blood, soot and plaster dust. Arms and legs trembled with fatigue, yet they still gripped rifles and triggered MGs with ruthless precision, determined to make the enemy pay for every step. After 3 days of this howling slaughter, finally, on March 20th, the order came to withdraw across the Oder Bridge. The Russians had swung their main weight up from the south along the river, aiming to seize the crossing and snare us all in a final sack. By afternoon, we had clawed our way to within just 300 meters of the bridge road, our only hope of escape. The last remnants of our division somehow halted the Soviet push for a few critical hours. As darkness fell, our retreat began. But by then, the Bolsheviks had ranged their anti-tank guns squarely on that final street. What followed was a desperate run through a gauntlet of fire. Observers picked out the flares of our exhausts, guiding gun crews to rake the road. As we tore forward in our half-tracks and trucks, shells screamed in, shattering buildings and sending jagged masonry spinning across our path. It was long minutes of nightmarish tension, every second expecting the blast that would end it all. Somehow, battered and breathless, we made it. Vehicle after vehicle bounced over the bridge, engines racing, until at last we rattled across to Stettin's western bank. Only once the final rearguard had cleared did the engineers bring the charges down, sending our lifeline crashing into the dark river. The bridgehead at Stettin had been a patch of German soil drenched with blood, where some of Germany's finest divisions fought a last ferocious stand against the eastern juggernaut. Now it was gone. The fields beyond were littered with Soviet dead by the thousands. They had thrown entire elite divisions into that grinder and left them there, annihilated by our dwindling, soot-smeared lines. Thousands of our own best, drawn from farms and factories and universities alike, lay scattered across that furnace. It was a fearful price, paid in full measure. Was this what the old Nordic sagas meant by the twilight of the gods? The Russian assault slackened. Their attacking divisions were spent. It would take them precious time to drag up fresh armies. So for a few weeks, quiet settled over the Stettin front. Those of us who had survived, death panting at our shoulders until the very last minute, huddled beyond the Oder in shaky relief. Was this to be our own Beresina, our doomed echo of Napoleon's frozen retreat? We wondered bitterly how different it might have been if we'd possessed even half the Russians' tanks, guns, or endless fleets of bombers. Relief units moved up to hold the line. We slumped down, worn to the marrow. Slowly, from that hollow, haunted mass of grey coats, something like a human company took shape again. In front of us lay a land that only a few years before had brimmed with promise, driven by bright hopes of reconstruction, a harmony of peoples building a new era. It should have become a wellspring of culture, invention, art, pouring fresh strength into the world for centuries. But now it lay gutted, cities crushed by Allied bombers into steaming heaps of rubble. Phosphorus rains had incinerated ancient towns, beautiful timbered houses and graceful gables reduced to jagged bones. Each night saw women, children, the elderly roasted alive or suffocated in firestorms. Millions more fled, homeless, stumbling down roads that offered no refuge. In the chaos, families were torn apart, mothers and children scattered, many never to reunite. Those who stayed clawed out lives in basements and caves, medieval again in their own lifetime. Yet even so, they clung to a fragile hope of someday standing equal with other nations, despite years of humiliation. Our reconnaissance battalion, Nordland's proud Panzeraufklärungsabteilung, was now a battered shadow of itself. For the second time in 6 weeks, we rumbled through Stettin, heading west. The city, half flattened by Allied raids, now burned anew under Russian shell fire. Few civilians haunted the streets anymore, though soldiers moved everywhere. Defensive works sprang up in every park and square, guns dug into boulevards, foxholes zigzagged down avenues, trucks positioned at crossroads for last-ditch barricades. Assault guns crouched behind mounds of stone, Nebelwerfer and mortars nestled among charred beams. Above it all hung a sickly black-yellow haze from burning Altdam spreading now across Stettin itself. We watched it pass with deadened eyes. The will that once lit our faces was gone. On the front, sheer danger and adrenaline had propped us up long after fatigue should have crushed us. But now, drawn back from the jaws of death, our bodies remembered how to be tired. It was a monstrous weariness, arms and legs heavy as lead, faces and backs aching, minds so numb we could hardly think. Simple thoughts broke apart, unable to finish themselves. In the half-tracks, men slumped like sacks, half asleep even as we jolted over ruts. The drivers and vehicle commanders forced themselves to stay alert, dragging the long column to safety by sheer grit. At last we reached Wasso, west of Stettin, where our supply echelon waited. The column broke apart, companies peeling off to different camps. We formed up with mechanical obedience on a wide farmyard. The company commander gave out orders, daily tasks, billets, weapon checks. Everything came through a haze. Even stripping and cleaning our weapons, normally a matter of minutes, dragged out painfully. Fingers numb, we dropped parts over and over, swearing, then had to clean them again. Sometimes we simply stared into space, caught in blank stupor, before blinking back and forcing ourselves to continue. At last, quarters arranged by the supply men, we collapsed into straw. I fumbled off my boots with clumsy hands, sinking towards sleep so deep it felt like drowning. Then a soot-black face poked over me. It was Ragnar Johansson II, the giraffe, our commander's lanky driver. He gave me a rough shake, grinning like a chimney sweep as I cursed and protested.